Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for the ears of ordinary men. 8 seconds. That's all it takes for a forbidden truth to take root in your mind. 8 seconds for the walls of the world you thought you lived in to crack. So hear this. Nancy Green did not simply survive her masters. She studied them, she watched them, and in the end, she erased every one of them from the inside out. But you and I, we are not here for the myth. We are here for the part of the story that has been buried, redacted, and disinfected by the same institutions that still teach you to bow, still teach you to obey, still teach you to swallow whatever version of history keeps you small. You are here because something in you is tired of being kept asleep. Now picture it. Virginia, 1851. A plantation that looked like paradise to outsiders. White pillars, trimmed hedges, polite smiles. But beneath all of it, beneath the floorboards and the barns and the pretty illusions of southern gentility, there was a science project running in secret. Not the kind taught in universities. Not the kind recorded in textbooks. A darker breed of science, the kind practiced by men who believed power was their birthright and human beings were raw material. Harwick Plantation. 3,000 acres of deception. 200 enslaved souls repurposed as experimental subjects. And at the center of it all, Dr. Edmund Harwick, a man who claimed he was measuring the hierarchy of mankind. But in reality, he was trying to manufacture it. Not through logic, not through truth, but through control, poison, deprivation, forced breeding, environmental manipulation, whatever instruments allowed him to carve a new racial mythology out of living flesh. And into this machinery of cruelty stepped Nancy Green, 22 years old, educated in secret, sharper than the men who mistook her for property. A woman with eyes that saw too much and remembered everything. She was never supposed to understand their experiments. She was never supposed to read their journals. She was never supposed to have access to the one secret that would eventually undo the entire Harwick bloodline. But she did. And before this descent is over, you will understand exactly how she used that secret to blind every man who tried to own her. You need to understand something before we go any deeper, because this is where most men hesitate, where most minds retreat back into the comfort of ignorance. But not you. If you're still here, it means the lock on your old worldview has already begun to break open. So listen closely. The Harwick family presented themselves as pillars of refinement, church-going aristocrats, patrons of progress, protectors of Southern virtue. But behind their polished manners, there was something colder, a mindset you still see in powerful institutions today. The belief that human beings can be categorized, engineered, weaponized. That society is not something that grows, it is something built, brick by brick, bone by bone, by those bold enough to control the blueprint. And Nancy Green found herself at the center of that blueprint. She was placed first in the main house, not because they thought she was useful, but because Harwick wanted proximity. Observation. He had already listed her in his journals as Subject 1. Exceptional cognitive potential despite inferior cranial metrics. That's how he saw her. Contradiction. An anomaly he wanted to break open like a specimen jar. He watched her while she cleaned the study. He watched her as she served dinner. He watched her as she read labels on jars she pretended not to recognize. He watched her like a man studying something he feared might outgrow its cage. And Nancy understood this long before Harwick imagined she did. Her mother had taught her, power isn't about what they do to you. Power is about what they think you cannot see coming. And Nancy saw everything. She noticed how Harwick locked his journals with a key he kept beneath the third book on the left shelf. She noticed when shipments of glass vials arrived from Baltimore heavy enough to require 2 men, but labeled simply as agricultural aids. She noticed how the plantation's water tasted metallic only in certain seasons, and how sickness always struck the same groups of enslaved workers at the same time. Harwick believed he was experimenting with environmental variables. Nancy realized he was experimenting with people. And in that realization, something shifted, not in Harwick, but in her. The seed of a plan. The beginning of a revenge so precise, so methodical, so utterly invisible, that the Harwicks would never see it until it was too late. Because Nancy wasn't just surviving the experiment. She was learning how to run it. There's a point in every descent where the world stops looking familiar. A point where the veil thins, and you begin to realize that the people in power, the ones who claim to guide, teach, protect, are often the very architects of your confusion. Nancy reached that point on a humid morning in August 1851. The morning she heard the truth spoken openly, without hesitation, because the men who said it believed she was too insignificant to understand. She had been sent to deliver lunch to Harwick's converted laboratory, a former tobacco barn retrofitted with metallic tables, glass cylinders, and instruments that chimed with a cold, clinical sound. She approached quietly, tray balanced in her hands, and that's when she heard them, Harwick and Dr. Samuel Cartwright himself. Two men of science. Two men shaping the intellectual foundation of Southern power. Two men speaking about human beings with the same tone they used to discuss soil, timber, livestock. Cartwright's voice smug, nasal, dripping with confidence, cut through the barn door. You understand, Edmund, if you can isolate behavioral compliance through controlled physiology, you may secure the South's stability for the next century. Controlled physiology, compliance, stability, words that still echo in modern systems. They changed their language but not their intentions. Harwick responded with that calm, devout certainty found in men who believe cruelty is a form of morality. I have promising results. The strain we introduced into the well has begun altering temperament. Reduced agitation, slower reaction time, more manageable dispositions. Nancy froze. She had tasted that water. Her sisters had tasted it. Half the plantation had. And now she understood the metallic tang. Now she understood why certain workers collapsed during harvest, why some developed tremors, why children cried in their sleep without knowing why. This wasn't discipline. It was chemical obedience. Nancy stayed silent, breath controlled, eyes narrowing with a focus that would have terrified Harwick had he seen it. She placed the tray at the door, listened a moment longer, then walked away with her pulse steady as stone. This was the day her transformation began. The day she stopped being a witness and became a strategist. Because Nancy realized something Harwick never considered. If you understand the blueprint, you can break the structure. If you understand the system, you can poison the system. If you understand the master's methods, you can turn those methods back on him with perfect precision. But descending into that kind of clarity requires commitment. So before we continue, comment the phrase, "I see through the machinery" twice. Do it to lock in the transformation you came here for. There's a moment every man encounters when the world he thought he lived in collapses and a darker, truer world rises behind it like a shadow stepping into the light. For Nancy Green, that moment came not with fear, but with calculation. Most people, when confronted with horror, recoil. Nancy observed. Most people, when discovering they are being controlled, panic. Nancy studied the nature of control itself. She began with the journals. Every night, after the household slept, Nancy moved like a whisper through the main hall, past the portraits of stern Harwick ancestors glaring down from gold frames. She entered the doctor's study with confidence. Not fear, because fear is loud. Calculation is silent. She removed the third book on the left shelf, retrieved the brass key hidden beneath, and opened the journal that held the architecture of Harwick's madness. Inside, she found more than measurements, more than notes about temperament alteration, more than sketches of glands, organs, and skulls measured with obsessive precision. She found the names of the people he viewed as components. Her sisters, children, elders, men whose entire lives were reduced to symptoms and reactions. And she found something else, something that made her pulse slow to a careful, controlled rhythm. A list titled Planned Adjustments. Under it, written in Harwick's immaculate handwriting, were instructions for increasing the toxicity in the water supply. Dosage adjustments, predicted behavioral outcomes, estimated survival ranges. 6 days. 6 days until the plantation's entire enslaved population began collapsing into irreversible neurological decline. That was when Nancy understood two truths. First, Harwick was not simply experimenting. He was eliminating variables. He wanted subjects who did not resist, minds that did not question, bodies that moved but did not fight. Second, Nancy had exactly 6 days to destroy the system from within, and she was willing to pay any price. She did not run. She did not hide. She slowed her breathing, memorized every line, every number, every ingredient. Then she returned the journal to its place, turned the key, and walked out as though nothing had changed. Because the greatest mistake the Harwicks ever made was assuming Nancy Green lacked power. But Nancy had the one power they never measured: strategic patience. Revenge, for her, was not an act of rage. It was an equation. And now she had every variable she needed. The next dawn broke with a deceptive calm, a thin fog drifting over the fields, the kind that softens the world and hides the teeth beneath it. Nancy rose not as a servant that morning, but as an architect of collapse. Remember this: true power does not announce itself. True power moves quietly, rearranging the world beneath the feet of men who think they own it. That's what Nancy did. Her first step was simple. She watched. Not like prey watches a predator, but like a strategist watching the predictable movements of pieces on a board they no longer realize they're standing on. She tracked who drew water from which barrels. She noted which Harwick family members drank sweet tea, which preferred the well, which chose wine at breakfast like aristocrats hiding from their own fear of the heat. Because Nancy wasn't planning a single strike. She was building a cascade. A carefully engineered series of triggers that would make the Harwicks fall not all at once, but one by one, blind to the pattern until it swallowed them whole. The second step came that afternoon, when Cordelia Harwick called her into the garden. Cordelia was all lace, perfume, and sharpness, her voice sweet, her words venomous. She wanted Nancy to trim the roses, but as she spoke, a folded letter slipped from her pocket. The seal bore the insignia of the American School of Anthropology. Nancy retrieved it, and in that instant, she saw a glimpse of Cordelia's nature: curiosity simmering beneath cruelty, a desire to be seen as intellectual worthy of her husband's grotesque ambitions. This was leverage. Every tyrant has a vanity. Cordelia's was recognition, so Nancy used it. She spoke of medicinal plants her mother had taught her. She praised Cordelia's scientific understanding of their properties. She offered to prepare a tonic that would enhance clarity and focus. And Cordelia, eager to be acknowledged, accepted without suspicion. Another variable set. Another piece moved. But the most important moment came that night, as the cicadas screamed outside and the moon hung low over the plantation. Nancy stood at the wooden rail of the well, hands steady, mind sharper than steel. She knew how Harwick had poisoned her people, and she knew how to reverse the flow, not to save the Harwicks, but to blind them literally and figuratively in the same way they had blinded themselves with arrogance. Because Nancy understood the principle that separates the powerless from the powerful. When you cannot confront the system directly, you infiltrate it, you reroute it, you turn the master's tool into the master's downfall. And tonight, the reversal began. Night on the plantation was never truly silent. There was always something moving: wind sliding through the pines, the distant cry of an animal, the uneasy shifting of men and women who had forgotten what uninterrupted sleep felt like. But on this night, the silence held a different weight. Tension. A pause in the rhythm of a place that sensed something fundamental had begun to change. Nancy stood alone at the well, lantern dimmed, her shadow long and patient against the stones. She reached into her apron and withdrew a palmful of crushed leaves, plants Harwick imported from South America, believing they dulled the mind. Nancy understood their real properties better than he ever did. Her family's herbal lineage went deeper than any textbook he quoted. She knew how to weaken their effects, and she knew how to invert them. Harwick wanted sedation. Nancy would give him clarity so sharp it would slice through the lies he'd built. Because clarity is dangerous to tyrants. It forces them to confront the truth they spend their lives avoiding. Their power is an illusion that evaporates the moment someone stops believing in it. Nancy released the powder into the water, watching as it dissolved into the depths with slow, swirling grace. Not enough to kill, not yet. just enough to disrupt Harwick's experiments, distort his predictions, awaken consequences he never calculated. She understood the chain reaction she was setting in motion. Cordelia, drinking her focus tonic, would soon become paranoid. Captain James, the overseer, would begin experiencing visual distortions, phantoms at the edge of his vision. The teenage sons, Thomas and William, would feel their hands tremble, their tempers spike uncontrollably. Harwick himself, consuming the water daily in his tea, would spiral into a frenzy of miscalculations. All of this would weaken the machine from within. Nancy wasn't simply poisoning them. She was reprogramming the hierarchy. Dawn approached as she walked back to the quarters. Her sisters watched her with quiet questions in their eyes, but Nancy said nothing. Not yet. Information, she understood, is most powerful when it arrives at the exact moment it is needed and no sooner. Back in the main house, Harwick continued his late-night scribbling, unaware that each line he wrote, each assumption he made, each hypothesis he believed was true, was built on contaminated data. For the first time, the great man of science was blind. Not physically, not yet, but intellectually, strategically, spiritually. Nancy had inverted the lens, shifted the foundation, placed a countdown beneath every one of them. This was no longer survival. This was war waged quietly, elegantly, and with absolute precision. By the third day, the Harwicks began to feel the shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. And this is where Nancy's brilliance revealed itself. Not in a single dramatic act, but in the slow, inevitable tightening of a noose that none of them could see, because they believed themselves untouchable. Cordelia was the first to unravel. The tonic Nancy prepared a blend of harmless herbs laced with the precise counteragent that disrupted Harwick's sedative compound did not calm her mind. It sharpened it just enough to let her glimpse the truth she'd spent her life suppressing. She became agitated, suspicious, convinced that something in the air was wrong. She snapped at the servants, demanded her children stay indoors, paced the halls whispering calculations she didn't understand. Vulnerability, Nancy understood, is the beginning of collapse. Next came Captain James. The overseer, brutal, arrogant, proud of his cold efficiency, began seeing movement where there was none, shadows where light should have been. At first he blamed exhaustion, then he blamed the enslaved, then he blamed himself for letting something slip. But he couldn't admit the truth, not even internally. His senses were fracturing. Nancy observed it all from her position in the house, silent, composed, gathering data the way Harwick once gathered it from her. But the most satisfying unraveling belonged to the doctor himself. Harwick's hands began to shake. Barely at first, just a tremor in the fingers as he measured powders in his laboratory. Then more violently, until a vial slipped from his grip and shattered across the floor. He cursed, muttering about unexpected variables, environmental contamination, and incorrect physiological responses. He never suspected the contamination came from the one person he'd built his empire upon. Because tyrants do not imagine their instruments becoming their undoing. That night, Nancy entered the study to deliver tea. He didn't look up. He was too consumed by frantic writing, pages filled with contradictions, crossed-out theories, and desperate attempts to explain the inexplicable deterioration of his subjects. His voice cracked as he spoke aloud to himself. This isn't right. The responses should be predictable. They should be compliant, manageable, consistent. Nancy placed the tea gently beside him, studying the trembling of his jaw, the twitch in his left eye. He was blind now, not to light, but to truth, to control, to the illusion he once mistook for invincibility. And in that blindness, Nancy saw the perfect moment approaching. The moment when she would strike the final blow, one that would erase the entire Harwick bloodline in a single calculated sweep. The downfall of the Harwick family did not arrive with screaming or spectacle. It arrived with precision, like a quiet hand extinguishing candles in a long hallway, one flame at a time. On the sixth day, Nancy woke before dawn. The sky was still black, the world suspended in that fragile moment before light decides to return. She tied her headscarf, straightened her posture, and stepped out into the humid air with the calm authority of someone who already knows the outcome. Because by now, every variable had aligned. Every dose had taken effect. Every weakness had opened like a crack in glass. Harwick stumbled from his study just after sunrise, eyes bloodshot, breath unsteady. He clutched his journal to his chest as though it alone could anchor him to the world he was losing grip of. Behind him, Cordelia collapsed into a chair, shaking, whispering that the house is listening. Captain James paced the yard in violent circles, swatting at shadows only he could see. The teenage sons argued over nothing, voices sharp, hands trembling, each moment pushing them further into disarray. The hierarchy had inverted. Nancy didn't raise her voice. She didn't strike anyone. She didn't need to. She simply stepped into the doorway of the main house, standing tall, centered, unafraid. And for the first time since they had purchased her, the Harwicks looked at her and saw something they could not quantify. Not a subject, not an experiment, not an anomaly, but a force. Harwick approached her, desperate, trembling so violently the journal slipped from his hands and fell open on the floor. Pages of calculations stared up at him like accusations. He whispered, "What did you do? Tell me what you've done." Nancy didn't smile. Revenge wasn't pleasure for her. It was justice, calm, inevitable, overdue. She said 6 words that ended the Harwick legacy more completely than poison or fire ever could. "I did only what you taught." Because it was true. Every method he used to diminish her became a tool she used to dismantle him. By evening, the plantation descended into chaos. Harwick collapsed into incoherence. Cordelia locked herself in her room, unable to distinguish reality from fear. The overseer fled into the woods, convinced spirits were hunting him. The sons turned on each other, blinded by panic. The empire of control imploded not from outside force, but from the weight of its own corruption. Nancy gathered her sisters. They walked away without looking back. Not escaping, ascending. And this, right here, is the truth most men never learn. Systems built on domination eventually destroy their architects. Because when you blind others, you blind yourself first. If you feel like something is watching you right now, you're not imagining it. Before we go any deeper into this forbidden archive, hit like so the algorithm knows you're not afraid, and subscribe so you don't miss the next artifact we unseal.